possible in the New Testament times that the entirety of a letter was read to the congregation, and we came close to that this morning. I'm sorry, that was probably middle-aged eyes missing the close of that reading. I'll shorten up a little bit here. This is the first part of that reading was about Paul changing the nature of Moses being veiled from something good to something confusing. This is the story of the Transfiguration as Luke gives it. 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, John, and James and went up to the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed. His clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. They appeared in glory and were speaking of Jesus' departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. Since they stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the two men stood with him. Just as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not knowing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them. They were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of any of the things they had seen. The reading ends here. Transfiguration Sunday concludes the set of readings we began after Christmas. What is the nature of Jesus? And as we've read, Jesus is a human being. He teaches, he heals, but now we get a hint of something much greater, a deep and abiding connection with the divine. We get, in essence, a preview of Easter there on the mountaintop. God is often pictured in God's presence as light, and the image of light pervades our readings this morning. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen pictures of Moses, and especially Michelangelo's famous statue where Moses has the commandments and he has horns coming out of his head. And you've wondered, why? Well, it's easy. It was a mistranslation. The Hebrew word for horn looks very close to the Hebrew word for shining. I assume that Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, eyes were getting a little tired, and he thought it said, Moses came down the mountain with horns instead of his face shining with the light of God. What Moses seemed to have received, being in the presence of God to get the new version of the 10 Commandments he had broken, was that he received some of the very presence, some of the very light of God shining in his own face. Moses is revealed to be like any of us, made in the image and likeness of God, but now his face shines. So often we say we want to feel close with God. But the truth is we often want to shy away from it. And so it is here. The people are afraid of Moses' shining face. So to ease their fear, he puts a veil over his face to ease some of that divine light and presence. Moses is a walking temple, and it's hard for the folks to bear, so they shield their eyes. Paul says that we are messengers, living letters, documents of Christ. We bear the very shining image of Jesus Christ in our lives. And Paul does a remarkable thing here. Instead of seeing the veil as protective, he talks about the veil being concealing. That folks don't get the message because we walk around with our eyes, our minds, our hearts veiled. We know about veils concealing. In some older marital services, the bride comes in veiled, and she will lift the veil only when the promises have been made and they are husband and wife. In radical Islamic countries, women are forced to wear a burqa, a veil, to conceal them as individuals, and yes, even to conceal what they're able to see, so that they have to remain home rather than in public more. Paul says that when we don't get the message of God, it is like we walk around veiled, half blind. But in Jesus Christ, he insists, our hearts and minds are unveiled, candid, made open. Finally, we see what God wants us to be. We see what God is like in Jesus Christ. In Jesus Christ, we see what God wants us to be. The veil is set aside. We see openly and clearly. And the result is transfiguration, transformation. All of us have our minds and hearts unveiled. Paul insists that all of us are being transfigured moment by moment, day by day, as we see who Jesus is more and more clearly. But its correlative is this. When we look in a mirror, we see a hint of the face of Jesus Christ. When we look at each other, we see the face of Jesus Christ. Mother Teresa had this idea very clearly. She would always be asked, how do you deal with the poorest of the poor in India? And she would always respond, I see in them the face of Christ. When I was a boy, women wore veils in Catholic Church. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was a reminder of respect, that they were in the presence of the Holy One when they entered church. That when we enter church, we come fully, or more fully, into the presence of God. When we walk through these doors, we walk more fully into the presence of God at worship. One of the background reasons for our architecture in this church, one of the background reasons for the music we choose in this church, is we're trying to lift hearts and minds beyond the mundane and have our minds and hearts lifted into a new sphere, the sphere of God entering into our lives. These high vaulted ceilings can't help but lift our hearts and minds up. The formal music we sing and hear has the self-same purpose, to lift us into a contemplation of the divine, to transfigure, to transform everyday experience as we approach the holy. Paul knows full well that God's work on us seems very slow, but it does change everything. Paul's whole life was changed on the Damascus Road, where he caught sight of the grace and glory of God. He realizes that we aren't perfect images of God, but we are being moved toward it day by day. Or maybe better put, God is present with us no matter how we look or even act. God's Spirit is at work within us and among us, within the struggling church of Corinth or the church in Alton, Illinois. What unveiling of our understanding does is allow us to start to perceive hidden realities, that we can look beneath the surface. We can live with that wonderful phrase that you can't judge a book by its cover. When our perception is open, when the veil is removed, we can peer more deeply into the very heart and ways of God. In a little while, the choir is going to sing an anthem called Transfiguration. If you're able, try to pay attention to the words. I'll just read some of the second stanza. Light breaks in upon our darkness, splendor bathes the flesh-joined word. Moses and Elijah marvel as the heavenly voice is heard. Eyes and hearts behold with wonder how the law and prophets meet. Christ with garments drenched in brightness stands transfigured and complete. We're going to have communion in a little while. The simplest of things, the crust of bread, a bare sip of wine. We are going to be bathed in the light of the presence of the living Jesus Christ. Light breaks in on our darkness. When we receive communion, we become part of that whole biblical story. We get a hint of ourselves in our Easter resurrected roles. Our daily lives, as the song will say, may prove us to be ones of the God we bless. We are being transfigured, aware or not, day by day, moment by moment, transformed in body, mind, and soul. Our question for this week is, what do you wish to see in the transfiguration God is working in and on us? What do you see with your eyes and heart suddenly